Hello and welcome once again to episode 37 of Code Completion. We are a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code. My name is Dimitri and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined today by my fellow completionist, Spencer.
Hey there.
And we have a special guest today, Michael Redig.
Hello.
So before we get into our main topic, it's time for IndieAppSpotlight. First up is SpamSieve by Michael Tsai, a Mac app that adds powerful spam filtering to your preferred email client. SpamSieve keeps track of your email and intelligently uses Bayesian spam filtering to easily catch spam before you do. It maintains an allow list to known good senders and a block list to known bad ones. It checks attachments and will even highlight how spammy each message is so you can check its work. Not to mention, you don't even need to leave your email app to use it. It just works. SpamSieve costs $30 to own or $48 for a family license, so please support Michael by trying it out. Finally, we have TableFlip by Christian Seitz, a Mac app dedicated to making Markdown tables. TableFlip makes it easy to switch between plain Markdown and a dedicated table editor, allowing you to edit your tables by adding rows and columns anywhere. When you're done, TableFlip will convert that table back to Markdown, making it easy for you to prepare your file. TableFlip costs $8.99 and is available on the Mac App Store, so please support Christian by entrusting it with all your tabling needs. And if you are an indie developer, we want to hear from you. Please reach out to us on Twitter at CodeCompletion via DM so we can spotlight your app in the future as well. So let's jump right into our interview. Michael, can you tell us about how you got into development and specifically Apple platform development? Because I'm assuming you're into iOS development, right?
A little bit, yeah. Do you mind if I ask a question about one of the indie apps that you mentioned first?
Oh, go for it.
So SpamSieve, that I have a vague recollection of that from like years and years ago. Is this an old app or is this a new app?
It's an old but very well maintained app.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's I've heard of it. I definitely should use that.
That's really cool.
Yeah, Michael Tsai makes a lot of good general utilities, I would say. So definitely check out all their apps.
Yeah, Tooth Fairy is great.
This site looks familiar. I've been there before.
Yeah, you probably follow him on Twitter, where he just in general posts links to stuff around the web that is all development related, and he does an excellent job at updating like past entries. So you can kind of see how that story evolves over time, which I really appreciate.
I'll definitely have to get that, and if you guys have me on here again, I'll give a review as to how I like the app.
Nice. Definitely. So how did you get into development?
I've from the earliest I can remember, my parents had a printing business growing up. And they had a Mac Plus to do all their page layout. And so the concept of programming was something that I didn't really get into until high school, but the innards of computers, how they work, and just the tinkering, hacking away at the keyboard, trying to get something to work, was something that intrigued me from the earliest memories I can remember, hacking away at the Mac Plus, breaking things, my parents getting mad at me so that because they'd have to fix the computer to get their business running. And eventually I learned how to fix it myself so that I could, venture around the computer, break things, then fix it so that I wouldn't get in trouble for my family to actually be able to continue to earn money to feed our family. And so I think it's kind of silly. When I had the assignments in class to write papers, I was using Quark Express, like professional $1,000 page layout software to do my homework, compared to every other kid used Microsoft Word to do their homework. And Quark Express was just what made sense to me at the time and what we had.
Yeah, I definitely have a very similar backstory as well. My mom also in graphic design. We grew up with Macs around the house, Quadras, old
That's
Power
awesome.
PCs. And all the software that she had was professional graphics software, including Quark Express. So I know exactly that feeling of using the top of the line professional page layout stuff and everyone else like handwriting their stuff still, not knowing anything about computers. And yeah.
What I think is exceptionally funny is because my parents had that, my mom taught me a lot of what I know about how to use computers. And it baffles me how many times she asked me the same questions about things she taught me how to do these things.
That's just like the peak irony right there. That's hilarious.
So it wasn't until high school then that you got into programming then?
Yeah, real programming. I guess technically there was... Okay, one thing that I think is an extremely fun factoid is that Cocoa, the name of the SDK that we use to make, I guess, iOS to a degree, but really Mac apps. That happened. That was just to the best of my knowledge, I should say, just a random trademark Apple had sitting around because they had it from a previous project, which happens to be my first foray into programming. If you aren't familiar, there was a program called Cocoa DR3 that Apple had in the mid-90s that was a very similar to what Scratch is nowadays, that MIT fun programming for kids thing. Apple had that in the mid-90s, called it Cocoa DR3, and it was this very intuitive way to work with sprites and have like a cause and effect kind of interaction between different things on screen that was kind of my first concept of introductory concept to like how the state of one thing can affect the other and variables will transition from one object to the next, that kind of concept there. And I never figured out how to push that further into real like code writing until I had a high school computer class that was it was introductory to computer science, where we learned how to write Perl scripts, and like everything kind of started to make sense at that point, all coming together, writing in Perl.
Yeah, Perl was actually my first language as well. I remember picking up a book from the library and not knowing anything about anything, and I'm like, I'm going to learn programming. So I would copy down...
That's an unusual like first language for... I don't know why my high school teacher chose that, because Python was definitely a better choice given the time frame that I learned this as well. But like fist bump.
it's what they knew, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember like copying down these pages of code because like that's the only way to get it onto the computer, right? You use your eyes. Right. And I was endlessly confused by the pipe character, which was printed as broken, and I'm like, I don't have this on my keyboard. You
mean like it was a line segment and then a horizontal space between halfway through?
Yes. So the pipe character, depending on like what font you were using, it was either broken or solid, right. And it was all broken all over the code examples, which I would assume makes it easier to like tell apart from like an L when it's being printed as monospace or whatever. And yeah, that was my first roadblock that I had to figure out over months of not knowing what I was doing. So yeah, kudos to Perl being the first language to learn. So when was it that you started making what you would consider as like an app today, or website, or things like that?
I mean, I guess technically before that I had dabbling in HTML, and I'd make crappy little websites for myself and my friends. When we actually did a Star Wars fan film in high school that would have actually pre-high school that would have predated my learning Perl, but that would have just been tweaking HTML and putting images in there. Doing like real code programming, there was a I can't remember how I came across it, but I stumbled upon a Udemy course that was showing how to use SpriteKit. It was like right after SpriteKit was released at DubDub. Not long afterwards, this Udemy course came across my vision somehow, and I just kind of looked at the introductory part of that, and I was like, I can do that. This looks really cool. And so I bought it, followed through it, and actually started a game company with a few of my friends. And we actually, from right there, like it was only a couple months later that we released we had a tower defense game. We had a little mini game kind of concept that we started developing on and actually released on the App Store, as well as a game that we started development on and never actually finished because, this side project for all of us was a side project,
Mm-hmm.
But it was a lot of fun. And actually, the tower defense game, I think, is still on the App Store unless Apple took it down because of like the new
The
API
64-bit.
32-bit purge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I did recompile it for the 64-bit
Oh.
conversion, I believe. I think it's still on the App Store, but it might not be. If it's not, it's something that's on my to-do list to make sure that it is.
Excellent.
That's
And what
really
was
cool.
that? What was that game called?
Arcade Defense.
So I think that's super interesting that you kind of got into iOS development with SpriteKit. And me having been someone that's never really touched SpriteKit other than some quick tutorials, how was the transition from building an app, like a game with SpriteKit into kind of the more traditional quote unquote app development that we kind of do today, table views and all that stuff? Was it fairly transferable? Like, I know that you're using Swift and everything, but
I actually wasn't.
architecturally, you weren't?
No, this was
Oh, were
Objective-C
you using
days.
Objective-C? Oh,
Yes.
right. Okay, that makes sense.
But yeah.
So yeah, tell us about that.
It was weird. Like, there's so much that I'd look up tutorials about how to do things that would, venture slightly outside of SpriteKit and use the UIKit components. And all of these tutorials assume some basic familiarity with UIKit that I had absolutely no familiarity with whatsoever.
Right.
And when I decided that it was worth looking into UIKit, it was like on its own, it was a little weird to cross that mental bridge between, SpriteKit is this, like, it was just siloed. SpriteKit's over here, UIKit's over here. It was not very long ago that I finally had that kind of epiphany that, SpriteKit is just a view that exists in UIKit, so I can manipulate it like any other UIKit component, just like I would any other UIKit component.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that there was definitely a very long time and quite a while where I actually tried to I built everything in SpriteKit. I had not really understanding the MVC or any kind of architecture whatsoever. I had my, whatever spaghetti architecture I used that was just run and gun, but it was all done in SpriteKit. All my models existed in there. All my views existed in there. It was SpriteKit for everything. And, it was a lot of fun, but it definitely grew into be a giant mess that I could barely maintain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely echo that kind of sentiment because pre-iOS, right when Core Animation came out, basically, that was like the framework that really allowed me to express myself in terms of user interface design. And I got to the point where everything was just layers. And I wasn't using any views anywhere, which made like event handling a nightmare, basically, because I had to do the translation myself between the views and the layers that they corresponded to, especially as I was getting fancy with my 3D projections and cover flow type UIs, what was cool back in the day. So like I definitely see where you were coming from, where you get really used to just doing something with one tool set, and it's kind of scary to venture outside of that because you feel comfortable there, right?
Yeah, definitely. Just as you said, that feeling of comfort to stick with what you know. Like I even made a couple efforts to venture out because like I mentioned, all those tutorials that would reach into UIKit for a component or two, and then come back into SpriteKit and interact somehow. It was something that I just felt like, okay, it's worth learning UIKit. Setting out to learn UIKit, I found a bunch of stuff that kind of got me started, but it wasn't until I went to Lambda that everything really clicked and really made sense.
So we'll get to Lambda in a moment, but I wonder nowadays with SwiftUI how similar that kind of sentiment is for a lot of new developers that are coming in. They are probably learning SwiftUI first, and as soon as you need to leave the safe space that is SwiftUI to kind of dabble with UIKit controls and stuff that is not just directly represented, I wonder if they're going to get that same sentiment as they need to ride this gangly UI view representable code everywhere to kind of make that bridge happen.
Right. Yeah. That's a really interesting thought. I had not considered that, and I expect that sort of mental silo is probably going to exist in a lot of people.
I think even now for us, or at least for me, that mental silo existed when SwiftUI was kind of coming out, and even now it's not like I'm using SwiftUI all the time. I'm mostly in UIKit, and so I think we maybe unintentionally silo ourselves off of like, this is where I'm comfortable, and just like you, Michael, we need to maybe break out and learn things because we know, well, okay, this is either going to be the future, or at least it's a component of the future. So, it's probably good to break out in some sense. I think we could, take that further and say, well, we all live in iOS land. Let's go to Mac OS, or let's go to Android or something. And I think, you could probably limit yourself to some extent, but continuing to learn things and branch out is probably a good idea. And, no doubt if you would have stuck with SpriteKit, you would have been great at it. But like you saw, it didn't quite do everything that you needed it to once you kind of hit a certain point. So that's really interesting.
I mean, I even went to like Dimitri mentioned, like handling events. I went to the degree of writing effectively a framework for SpriteKit to be able to create buttons very similar to what UIKit ultimately did. But I don't think I had used UIKit to that degree to know how UIKit buttons worked. I just wanted buttons. I wanted to have a dynamic button framework in SpriteKit so that I'd be able to add a button to the screen that would just make a button given a little bit of context. Like, here's a button, do this. And yeah, that I just lost my train of thought, but
I go ahead.
I also do want to just point out that it sounds like I was very ambitious and hopped on that, crossing that mental silo right away. But I should point out that that was over the course of I learned SpriteKit and did that kind of stuff in like around 2012, 2013, and it wasn't until probably several years later that I actually reached out into UIKit. So it's not like I was extremely virtuous and disciplined right away. Like it was a long transition to realize that I needed to do that kind of get out of my comfort zone. So
I think that's fine. I mean, none of us are virtuous in the sense of we're going to go out and learn every single framework that they just announced at DubDub. Like no one.
Exactly.
Well, maybe Paul Hudson does that, but that's probably it.
Yeah, I just don't want to set expectations for others that they need to be able to do that right away. Like taking time is fine, is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely.
And I was a little curious too, since you started with Objective-C, how was the transition going from Objective-C to Swift for you?
I actually hated Swift when it came out. I felt very comfortable. It was the square brackets were very comforting for me. It just very visually delineated what stuck together. It was actually kind of nice. But it was... I took several breaks away from programming, which also contributed to those several years of time elapsing between things. But one of the times I came back, Swift had evolved, I think, to version 3 at that point, and I decided to take another look at it to see had it evolved. One of the things that I really hated about it in the first iteration was I rely heavily on code completion. I will type the first few characters or several characters that are spread throughout the symbol that I'm trying to express, and let the editor handle the busy work of filling in all the letters that I didn't want to type. So doing that with Swift in the early days was slow, ridiculously slow, and I couldn't handle that. Plus, I was happy with the syntax I had in Objective-C already, so why? But around Swift 3, the speed had caught up to the point where it would actually keep up with me in the editor to fill out code completion. And the syntax in general had evolved to the point where it flowed very well. And whether it was Swift evolving or me stepping away and coming back to it that allowed me to have a fresh take, not directly comparing it to what I felt comfortable with in Objective-C. I don't know what it was exactly, but coming back to it, I'm 100% Swift and actually kind of abhor Objective-C usage now.
Yeah, using both languages is definitely tough if you are stuck in a code base that has both. You end up one day putting semicolons where they're not supposed to be, and another day forgetting that they exist and typing like lines and lines of code, and nothing is happy at you, especially code completion just completely breaks. It's definitely a good thing when you can work on just like one language at a time, especially for a long duration of time. I wouldn't go so far to say that I like one over the other. I mean, essentially you can do the same things with both languages, which I think is a testament to how well Apple builds a lot of their frameworks, that everything is just available. I remember someone saying Objective-C compatibility in Swift was probably the thing that slowed it down the most, but at the same time, that's what allowed Swift to take off, right? If we weren't able to use all the frameworks that are currently still written in Objective-C, then we wouldn't have anything at the moment.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say I abhor Objective-C. Just I like Swift so much relative. Mm-hmm. It's dwarfed. I still definitely have an affinity for Objective-C, and to be honest, it's probably primarily nostalgia, but there are definitely things that are cool about the language on its own that are unique from Swift.
I mean, you went from one wacky language, Perl, to another wacky language, Objective-C, so you're all good.
Yes, that is very true.
You were never introduced to a normal programming language, so it all just flowed.
I think that's like one thing with these languages, when you are kind of going back and forth, is for a long time I absolutely hated Objective-C too, and then I used it a little bit more, and now I work, like Dimitri said, I'm in one of those code bases where I'm using both Objective-C and Swift every day. And so at this point, it's pretty normal to me, but Dimitri can attest, for a few months when I started my new job, I would just go in our like personal code completion Slack and just be like, I forgot the parentheses around a conditional statement, or I keep forgetting whatever, and it's hard to kind of mentally shift that. But then a month or so ago, I look at bool all uppercased as like the right way to put bool, instead of lowercase, and so it's weird how your perception of the language changes, and like your thoughts on it, I guess, if that makes sense. So, not that one is better than the other. It's just they're different, but like Dimitri said, that's the best part, is that you can use them both and kind of feel comfortable with whichever one you want to, and there's heavy overlap there.
I think we can all agree, though, that across all languages, having an all uppercase yes and no as our Boolean types is the best option.
It's very assertive.
It is.
One of my friends, who is a C++ programmer, couldn't stop laughing at me when I would write out Booleans in yes and no format, screen sharing with him.
Like, whoa.
I mean, something you have to like about Objective-C is a lot of it was just a bunch of type defs that just like auto-magically compiled to real code. And that includes like yes and no. Those were just type defs for 1 and 0. And the simplicity of that is something that I think was really good to have. It's not that anymore. If you actually go and check in Xcode, there's no header file that imports yes equals 1 and no equals 0. That is taken care of by the compiler now. And a lot of those magic, or I should say non-magic bits turned into magic that just became part of the language over time. And a lot of Swift still feels that way, where it's like very much magic that something will work or something will not work. And I think that is one of the pieces that makes it a much harder language than something like Objective-C to kind of get into. Objective-C, the language itself is very straightforward. There's a few rules, and once you know them, you're good and you're happy. But something like Swift has many different types of rules that you need to keep track of if you want to use the language to its full potential. And then all of a sudden, a lot of stuff becomes ambiguous and hard to reason about, especially when you need to type it from memory, because autocomplete is not necessarily going to help you with those certain situations because it doesn't know what you're trying to get to.
Right, yeah. I've been fortunate enough that none of the projects I've been working on have broken autocomplete just fundamentally. So that is, I mean, I don't see any detriment to leaning heavily on autocomplete just because it's such an important tool that speeds you up when it's available. I do get that, there will be times where, excuse me, the compiler is too slow at filling out autocomplete that it'll just not work. So you'll have to learn the harder way. But I do also feel like you will naturally learn the rest of the language just through exposure when using autocomplete.
So a quick aside, have either of you checked out what's that new thing that GitHub has?
The GitHub thing? No.
Yeah,
Copilot?
Copilot, yeah.
No, I haven't looked into it.
I've heard of it.
So it's for the listeners out there who haven't heard of it, it's basically autocomplete with machine learning. So if you say, I want a function that checks if a number is odd or even, it will just autocomplete that entire function for you. And it seems to work like 1 time out of 10 for like complex things, which is amazing that it works at all. And I wonder if like something like that is a good thing to have in the long run as developers, or if it's just going to make mistakes easier to do, since if that version of autocomplete doesn't know what the correct pattern actually is, it's just kind of figuring it out from context of past code. Is that actually a benefit?
Yeah, it sort of seems like a crutch to me in the sense, in a similar sense of the way that people will sometimes abuse Stack Overflow, where they're not really thinking about the solution, they're just saying, give me a solution.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a very specific instance of that where, I can't remember the specific article, but someone wrote an article about how he answered a question and it was technically wrong, but still worked in most cases. And it became one of the most used pieces of code just in general in code bases on the internet. And I could definitely see a situation like that kind of take hold through the Copilot where if it sources some piece of code that will work in a lot of cases, but not some edge cases, we could end up with a lot of code that is fundamentally incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we took quite a detour, going back to your adventure to making apps. So you started off making SpriteKit apps, and you actually put those on the App Store. When was it that you started making more UIKit focused apps that you would probably say are properly built for their purpose, rather than using SpriteKit to get to that end?
I mean, if properly built is a requirement, that's much more stringent than just using UIKit. But I made in high school, I was always a bit of an oddball. Instead of the TI Texas Instruments graphing calculators that everyone else used, I used HP calculators. And that had a feature that is known as reverse Polish notation. And I fell in love with that method of using a calculator, but I wasn't satisfied with any of the apps that were on the App Store for RPN calculators, at least the free ones. There may have been good ones that were paid, but I was too cheap at the time. So I wrote an RPN calculator, and that was primarily written in UIKit, which was extremely messy and bad in terms of the code, but it worked, and I put that up on the App Store, and I still use that as my calculator app today.
Nice. That's awesome.
It's not very popular, for the record, but
I don't think reverse Polish notation calculators are very popular in general, so I wouldn't take it personally.
But yeah, that was probably the first one that I did outside of SpriteKit.
So, and then kind of continuing on this journey, how did you end up going from there to, from SpriteKit to finally diving into UIKit to, being where you are now, where you are a full-time iOS engineer? How did you kind of, bridge that gap, I suppose?
Well, I got a job doing IT for an MSP. Just to fill in the blanks here, an MSP is a managed service provider that does IT services for not just a single business. It does IT for clients. And the idea is that instead of these hundreds of businesses each having their own IT, they outsource it to us. And I was getting sick of that job. I like the people I work with, but the job itself was dealing with Windows all the time, and that's just nonsense I don't want to deal with in my everyday life. So I wanted to get back into programming more and pursue that more heavily. So I decided that I'd move out west and look for a job. Around the same time that I decided to do that, my body was backing up a little bit. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis in high school. Ulcers in the large intestine. I'll not get into the graphic details for the sake of the podcast, but it's not fun. So I was in remission, doing pretty well while I was working at my IT job. But as I decided to move on from the IT job, which, mind you, was very stressful, probably largely committed to the flare-up of ulcerative colitis that happened. But as I decided to move, that happened. This was after we had bought a house and it was a rental, so we could then rent it out to other people, but we had already signed a lease to rent it out to other people before my ulcerative colitis had flared up. So we had to move in with my sister and just kind of mooch off of her for a year, we being my wife and I. Having decided to pursue programming now, I had applied to a lot of jobs, and I was kind of getting depressed in terms of what's the point that I keep applying, I keep getting rejected, I keep applying, I keep getting rejected. I'd never even got an interview, as I recall. So on one hand, I was okay with it because given the assumption that that's what it's just like, it's just a matter of getting numbers, like just keep applying and finally you'll get something. But since I didn't know if that was the case or not, I just was lost. I didn't know whether I should keep trying or whether it was not normal to have that kind of result. And I didn't know anyone to ask to find out if this was normal and I should just keep trying or if I should change my tactics somehow. And it was somewhere in that time span that living with my sister that I came across Lambda and thought, just given the reviews and the research that I did on the company and the education they provide, it seemed like a good place to go to both fill out my fundamentals, because that was something that I felt like was potentially holding me back in general, just the utter basics. And beyond that, they had career services. So they'd have support there to find out, like, is what I'm doing with just massively applying and not getting any responses, is that normal? And I just have to keep trying and keep playing the numbers game.
Right.
And yeah, that was one of the best decisions I've ever made. I guess to fill that out a little further, going to Lambda filled in the basics. Like I had a lot of the high level concepts already understood, like just the way code works and flows. But then Lambda was something there that really helped fill in the basics of, design architecture and how to, make your project manageable. And then filled in a lot of just connecting the dots between how one component of UIKit worked and flowed with another, and things that just weren't intuitive or explicitly written in the tutorials that I've experienced on the internet. And that the curation of the lessons and the lesson plan and the actual, again, the focus on actual design architecture, which is not something I see very frequently in tutorials, or even my college friends talk about how they wish they were taught design in architecture design in their college classes. But that's something I had in my education here. This is turning into an ad for Lambda, it sounds like.
Well, not that they have an iOS program right now anyway, so.
Which is unfortunate, because it was a blast. I loved it.
I was talking about, okay, so backing up, I can't remember if I talked about this in one of the last few episodes or if it was in just Dimitri and I speaking. We were talking about Vapor a few episodes ago, and I mentioned that you had built, for one of your projects in the computer science portion of Lambda School, you had built a multi-user dungeon. That was one of the assignments. And you decided to use Vapor with WebSockets, right? Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, I can't remember the exact sequence of events, because the first time we went through it, we used Django the first time around, but then I can't remember if it was part of the school project or just because I wanted to do it on my own, I rewrote it in Vapor with WebSockets. Yes.
That's super cool. We were just, a lot of that episode was dedicated to, making a REST API and building a front end with some HTML and CSS. But Dimitri pointed out, you can use things like WebSockets. And I thought that was a really cool kind of real world example of using sockets to build this whole entire multi-user dungeon with Vapor. So yeah, just kind of an aside, but I thought that was super cool. Both when you were a student and now.
Definitely enjoyed it.
It's a testament to Vapor that it makes it easy to do and jump into, right? I assume that was your first time using Vapor, Michael?
I mean, doing a real project, I think so. Beyond, I probably did like a couple tutorials that were just like throwaway projects, make a to-do list kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So are you working on any projects right now that you're building
Like
up?
side projects or main work, do you mean?
Side projects, main work, whatever you're proud of.
Well, yes, definitely I am. Well, my full-time job is working at Nomi, which is a new startup. We are close to getting to the App Store, actually. And so that is a social app where it's designed to be able to catalog moments in your life and then archive them, share them with people who actually matter to you in a very privacy-centric way. And it's been a real challenge and a lot of fun, and I'm impressed with myself. I don't want to toot my own horn too hard, but like I'm really happy with what I've been able to do there. I am technically the iOS lead, and I'm not sure if I deserve that title or not, but that's what I am. And yeah, that's quite an exciting app. I was told that I am able to share the beta invite if we want to put that in the show notes at all. So
Awesome.
we can definitely throw that in there.
Yeah, definitely.
And side projects, if we include only the ones I'm actively working on, there's probably still too many to count, but the one that I'm working on most recently started when my extended family has an email list that just is continually going, and we were running into problems where my grandma was clicking on links and emails without any real mental filter, let's say. So we were getting worried that she was going to start getting scammed and, sending money to Nigeria. And so I made an app that just inspired by scrolling through Twitter. I came across this app that will listen to all the openings of links that you click on one app to open into another, and then route them to the correct app as it goes. And being inspired by that, I was like, hey, I could listen to links and then just stop you if you're opening them from email, for example. So I made an app that just sits in your menu bar that, like I said, listens for links as you click on them. If they come from your email app, then it'll be like, hey, did you mean to click that link? And it'll list out the link in full so that you, because you can click on an image and not know what actual URL is laying underneath that image. Mm-hmm. And ideally, you could, I'm trying to add this feature in where you can remove tracking from it so that you can, still follow the link, but without tracking. I want to do a few other things with it too, but the main thing is that it has you double check. Did you mean to click this link? This link could be suspicious. Double check that it says, if you click on a Facebook link, it says facebook.com in the URL, not fakebook.com or something to that effect. And yeah, that's the biggest
And what's
thing.
this app called?
That's a good question. I think I called it Email Link Protector. It's not very, not very clever. Just says what it does.
Awesome. Yeah.
Is that have you put it on the App Store?
Yes, it is on the App Store.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah, we'll
find
definitely. We'll be sure to link to it in the show notes as well.
It's a very limited quality app right now, and I'm working on an update that will definitely improve the UI and flow by a lot when I finally get out.
Awesome. Yeah, we don't want to be sending money to Nigerian princes, even though they're good princes.
Exactly.
They're good.
I mean, if
princes,
there's a
Brent.
real Nigerian prince, I mean that might be one thing, but.
And since you have a long history of dabbling in programming, but not quite jumping in all the way until most recently, what sort of advice or tips would you give to anyone else that kind of wants to do development full time but just never took the plunge yet?
I don't know if I have anything new or innovative to say that hasn't been said a million times before already, but I've always lived my life by the philosophy that I don't think I'm smarter than anyone else. I think just me personally, I think I just care more about learning, and that's something that you can decide to do on your own. So if you decide that you want to learn something, do it. And
I think that's great advice.
The rest will come.
Yeah, definitely. So then I guess, do you have any questions for us as people that potentially have more experience in development than you, or anything of that sort?
Pick our brains. Part of interviews. This is the part of interviews that, and I'm speaking to like job interviews that I'm the worst at.
It's the most important part.
It definitely is, and I'm a horrible example because I usually say I'm simultaneously both insanely curious, but also like I like to filter out the noise, so I don't ask what I feel like are nonsense questions or things that I already know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean that to sound conceited either, but there's like.
Well, no. Well, let me just to kind of put this into perspective. The questions that you ask us are going to determine whether or not we ask you to be a co-host again. So, no pressure or anything. I'm totally kidding.
Gotcha.
Yeah, this is a real interview, by the way. You start on Monday.
I can't think of anything right now, but I kind of have a blank mind coming into this interview, so I apologize for not having that kind of question prepared.
No, not at all.
That's all good.
This week's episode of Code Completion is brought to you by Pennant. Calling all sports fans. Want to keep track of the season, but there's so many teams and not enough time? Check out Pennant. Pennant provides sports standings at a glance. Pennant displays league standings as a simple bar chart where the best teams rise to the top throughout the season. Of course, you can dig in deeper with team stats, game results, and more. Version 10 introduced the all-new customizable My Pennant view, where you can build a wide selection of visualizations for any sport, division, or team. Unlock Pennant Premium to add as many blocks as you'd like and put any of them on your home screen as a widget. Whether you follow MLB, NFL, NBA, NHL, or MLS, Pennant has you covered, with more sports and leagues coming soon. Thank you so much to Pennant for sponsoring Code Completion. Download Pennant on the App Store today. So now that we've gone through our topics, it's time for Complete the Code, where we quiz our listeners on your knowledge of Swift, Apple, and all things development. Spencer?
Yeah, so we have a winner from last week who is Michael McGrath. He writes Control plus Command plus E. And that is, of course, the correct answer. So if you place your cursor or select any variable using that key command on your keyboard, will let you interactively rename all instances of the variable in the current scope, making renames a cinch, luckily. Michael, our guest today, was actually just a few hours too slow, but he did also get the right answer. So no worries there. Your credit is still
Michaels
intact.
on this podcast are... We should rename one of us.
We should
and
all
now
be
we
Michael.
know the shortcut.
Yep.
That's right. Hey, there we go. Good one. I like that. So this week we have a file-based question for you. If you're listening to the podcast, you can check the podcast art or the show notes to follow along. So we have a method called checkIfExists that takes in a file path as a URL, and it returns a bool. Because this is in Swift, this is a capital B, lowercase, ool. It's not completely uppercase. What's the best way to check if the file that is passed in exists or not?
So can you complete the code? Tweet your answers to us with hashtag CompleteTheCode, all one word. And the first to get it right will get a shout out on the next show that we record. And that brings us to Compiler Error, my favorite segment, where I get to test my fellow completionists and guests' knowledge about Swift, Apple, and all things development. And today we have a theme, and that is obscure foundation file classes. So let's go to our first statement. And statement number 1, NSFileVolume is a class that allows you to perform fundamental file system operations on volumes, such as inspecting its partitions. Statement number 2, NSFileWrapper represents nodes in the file system, such as directories known as file packages, but can also represent regular files and symbolic links. Statement number 3, NSFileHandle provides a wrapper for file system descriptors, allowing you to perform basic file I/O such as reading, writing, and locking files. And statement number 4, NSURL protocol allows you to implement custom loading strategies for your own protocols, so they can be used anywhere a regular NSURL is used. So, Michael, as our special guest today, why don't you go first? Feel free to ponder aloud which one you think is the compiler error and therefore is false. The other 3 are completely factual, so good luck.
Okay, so I've used NSFileHandle before, so that I'd say that description is very apt for what it does. That seems correct to me. NSURL protocol is also something I'm vaguely familiar with. So again, that seems close, if not exactly correct to what it does. It definitely could be in the technical details that something is maybe a little bit off there, but I'm going to lean towards true on that one as well. File wrapper and file volume are not things I've used. I'm going to take a moment to read them in a little more depth, if you don't mind. If Spencer wants to muse aloud, go for it.
No, he's not allowed.
Oh. I want to say number 2 is probably the wrong one.
Okay. Spencer?
Yeah, I have also used NSFileHandle, and that seems like a correct description of it. So I'm going to say 3 is not the compiler error. NSURL protocol sounds familiar, although I've not used it before. I think that's a thing, though. I'm also kind of with Michael on whether it's number 1 or 2. What seems weird to me is both of them, because it seems weird that you would have something very specific to a volume. Well, no, I guess not. I don't know. File wrapper being representing a node in the file system kind of just seems like that's a URL. So I'm going to cover our bases here. I'll go with number 1, although I'm definitely not sure about it.
A sound strategy. So let's go over these one at a time, and we'll start with number 4. So NSURL protocol allows you to implement custom loading strategies for your own protocols, and this basically means you can define foo : to mean something special within your app. So this is not for when other apps click on a URL that has foo : This is strictly in your app. If you want to pass foo : to NSURL session, for instance, it will go ahead and use the URL protocol that you register with the system to actually load that resource. And this is super useful because it works anywhere URL works, whether that's for images or dictionary or anything really. And that's anything except AV Foundation, at least when I tried it back in iOS 4, which is a long yesterday. So it generally just works, which is pretty convenient and great because it allows you to customize all sorts of things. So that one is a code completion and is completely true. So good job so far. Let's go to number...
As I recall...
Yeah?
I believe I've seen NSURL protocol actually used in mocking as well to replace... Unless it was a similarly named type, it was used to replace the backing behind URL session to then load the mocking data as opposed to the actual reaching out to the internet.
Yeah, that's actually a great use for it. I never even considered that for mocking, but yeah, you can go ahead and do pretty much whatever you want, which is really nifty. And you don't even need to necessarily replace HTTP calls in general. You could have your own scheme that the rest of the URL is completely identical. And that way you can just change an endpoint setting and all your endpoints can then use that new scheme, for instance. So great input there. So that brings us to number 3. So NSFileHandle provides a wrapper for file system descriptors. allowing you to perform basic file I/O, such as reading, writing, and locking files. And this would be true if NSFileHandle was for file system descriptors, which it is, so good job so far. A file system descriptor is basically a number that the system gives you in its originality, and I think it's unique per process. And I might be wrong about that, but basically every process, when you open a file, it says, okay, this file is located at 1. And when you open the next file, this one's located at 2, and so on and so forth. And that's how it keeps track of things. And using an integer for these sorts of things is a great way to get confused quickly. So that's where NSFileHandle comes in, because it gives a nice object-oriented wrapper around all that, so that way you don't mistake what those types are, which is really easy to get all sorts of fancy bugs that way. So good job so far. This brings us to number 2. So Michael, you think this one is the compiler error, and let's go over it. So NSFileWrapper represents nodes in the file system, such as directories known as file packages, but can also represent regular files and symbolic links. So if you've ever used the NSDocument API and stuff like that, that uses NSFileWrapper to represent complex types like file packages. But I didn't actually know this before I was looking into it. It can also represent regular files and symbolic links. So if you have a link that you need to represent directly as like what it is on the file system, NSFileWrapper is there to help you out. So that's why it's not super obvious how to make those with NSFileManager, for instance, because you use NSFileWrapper to do that bit for you. So if you don't actually want to jump to where that linked file is going, you use NSFileWrapper, and it'll actually give you a representation of that link directly. So sorry, Michael, but good job, Spencer, because that means that number 1 is the compiler error, and that is because NSFileVolume does not exist. That was just a made-up class that I pulled out of thin air. So you are unfortunately not able to manipulate the volumes of file systems through the Cocoa APIs all that much. There are a lot of methods on NSURL which let you inspect it, however, so you can find out all sorts of information about a volume, like the amount of space that's free, how much is used, all that sorts of good stuff using NSURL, which seems like a weird place to have a whole bunch of file stuff, but that's where it's located. So that's why NSFileWrapper is different. So URL represents where the resource is, and the file wrapper represents the actual thing in the file system.
Is NSFileWrapper the class that would allow you to basically link to a file, move it to a different directory, but then still retain the link?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it looks like it. Add a symbolic link. Oh, it's deprecated. A file wrapper? Yeah, it kind of looks like it. I could be wrong, though. I know you can move things with File Manager, but as far as symbolicating a link goes, or a symbolic link goes, I'm not sure.
I don't know. Maybe it's NS bookmark.
Yeah, so a bookmark is actually just data saved in a regular file, and that's what an alias is. So there are bookmarking APIs on NSURL, and those are maybe what you're referring to?
Well, I don't know. I've not looked into it on the programming side. It's not something I've come across as a need myself, but I've noticed in some apps they will point to a file on the drive, on my hard drive. Specifically Mac here. I don't know if this would exist or be practical in iOS, but I've seen some apps that will point to a file on the system. I'll close the app, I'll move the file to a different location, open the app back up, and I typically expect that path to have been broken because it's in a new path compared to where it was before, right. So the app doesn't know where to look. But somehow the app sometimes can track that movement from one location to the next, even while it's not open.
Yeah, so that
uses bookmark.
That uses bookmark data, which is basically an alias. If you ever made one in Finder, so when you make an alias in Finder, and you open up that alias in a hex editor, that data that's in there is basically a plist that describes how to find that original file, and it saves 3 things, if I'm not mistaken. It saves the path, it saves the node ID, so the inode that the file system is tracking it under, and it saves one more thing. I think it saves like the volume information or something along those lines. And that way it can go ahead and find the file even if it moves, because it will keep that same identifier basically if you move it, because you're not, when you move a file, you're not actually moving the file on the file system, you're just saying it's located somewhere else, but the file actually stays exactly where it is, unless you're going from one volume to another, at which point that move is really just a copy and a delete. And that's where those bookmarks probably start failing.
Either way, I love that functionality. So all app developers out there that use that, thumbs up. I love it.
Yeah, so if you're making an app and you need to keep track of files, don't save paths, save bookmarks data that you can get from the NSURL.
Not to toot my own horn or anything, but I ironically just learned about bookmarks and used them today. So that's the only reason I was so confident about that being a bookmark.
So the world is aligning just for you. If
right.
Only the compiler was all about URL bookmarks, right? You would have been so ready for that.
I know, right?
But you still won today, so...
That's true, but that was more of a fluke than anything. I honestly probably would have gone with 2 had I been first.
Both of them sound so, like, NS file volume. It sounds legit.
That's what Dimitri's good at, man. He's good at coming up with those tricky ones.
So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Our listeners can find you at mredig, that's MEREDIG on Twitter. Anything else that you want to plug?
I guess, like I said, we'll be on the App Store soon, so I'll provide you guys with the link to our beta to put in the show notes, so you can sign up for Nomi and check that out.
Awesome.
And
as always, I want to personally thank everyone for listening in this week. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Code Completion to know when new episodes get released, and feel free to tweet at us if there's a topic that you'd like for us to dig into. Most importantly, as a small podcast, please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are also interested in any part of the process of app development. It's really your support that enables us to continue doing this, and we hope to grow a healthy community around everything we discuss. So once again, I want to give my thanks to Spencer, who is at Spencer C. Curtis, that's SpencerCurtis on Twitter, for joining me this week. My name, once again, is Dimitri, and you can find me at Dimitri Buñol, that's DIMITRIBOUNIOL, and we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.
See ya.